Welcome to the Human Archive. If you enjoy original science fiction stories about humanity finding its place among the stars, subscribe and join us for the next one. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. A Solved Problem. Director Joran Kelm had spent most of his career explaining that disease was not an enemy one defeated in a hospital. By the time the patient reached the hospital, medicine had already surrendered part of the battlefield. Civilizations defeated disease earlier. They monitored water, controlled food production, tracked unusual symptoms, sequenced new biological threats before those threats could spread. They designed cities with containment in mind and transportation systems that could isolate themselves without collapsing. They vaccinated when vaccination was useful, altered harmful inherited susceptibilities when the ethics and evidence justified it, and maintained public health organizations powerful enough to act before panic became policy. Joran stood before 32 young epidemiological coordinators at the Galactic Health Concordance and displayed an image of his homeworld. No naturally circulating infectious disease has established sustained transmission among the Olerics in 6,127 years, he said. The trainees knew the number. Every Oleric's child knew it. It was one of their civilization's quietest achievements. It was not a monument or a battle. It was an absence. Children who did not die of infections their ancestors had once feared. Adults who did not lose months of life to preventable illness. A civilization whose hospitals treated trauma, congenital disease, aging, environmental injury, and rare biological accidents, but almost never contagious disease originating in the population itself. Joran was proud of that. His pride was not abstract. His grandmother had belonged to the last generation that still received childhood lessons about the old Oleric's fever houses, even though no one alive remembered them firsthand. Joran had chosen epidemiology because he liked victories that became invisible. A successful outbreak response produced no monument and no heroic image. It produced ordinary mornings in which nobody became sick. He had spent 80 years helping preserve that kind of normality and had come to think of predictability as one of medicine's highest achievements. He believed he had earned the right to be. A human physician observing the training raised a hand. Dr. Laurel Fenwick had joined the Concordance only 3 weeks earlier. Joran had already learned that humans asked questions when silence would have been more convenient. "You said sustained transmission," Laurel said, "not infection." "Correct. So you still see imported organisms occasionally. Of course, no biosphere is perfectly sealed. And your immune architecture handles those. With medical support where necessary." Laurel nodded. Joran brought up Earth's history for comparison. It was one of the standard teaching contrasts. Humanity had entered interstellar civilization carrying medical archives that made Oleric students visibly uncomfortable. The archive listed smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis, malaria, cholera, polio, measles, HIV, and many others. Pandemics whose death tolls strained translation software simply because some civilizations had no modern cultural equivalent for that scale of uncontrolled infection. One trainee asked Laurel, "How did your species function?" Laurel gave him a dry look, "Poorly sometimes." Several students laughed. Joran did not. The numbers were horrifying. Humanity had endured repeated waves of infectious disease for most of its recorded history. Even after modern medicine emerged, pathogens had continued changing, crossing species barriers and exploiting human mobility. Earth's eventual control systems were impressive precisely because the problem had been so persistent. Joran switched back to the concordance model. Civilization is the process of converting biological uncertainty into manageable risk. The training chamber alarm sounded. It was not a station alarm. It was a medical priority alert. Joran's wrist display illuminated. Precursor research habitat Thales variant. Communication loss. Biological incident suspected. He dismissed the class and opened the full report. The habitat had been excavating a sealed structure beyond mapped Union territory. 3 hours earlier, one researcher reported fever and disorientation. 20 minutes later, 7 more became symptomatic. Then the station stopped transmitting. Laurel was reading over his shoulder. "That fast? We do not know whether the first observed patient was the first infected." Joran contacted emergency response. A containment vessel was already preparing to depart. Laurel looked at the dark station icon. What did they find out there? Joran expanded the precursor site. The structure was estimated to be at least 8 million years old. I suspect, he said, we are about to learn. He had no idea how much he would come to regret those words. Chapter 2. The First Failure. The Concordance response was nearly perfect. That mattered because there would be no comforting explanation later. The crisis did not begin because modern medicine had become lazy. The drones worked. The isolation protocols worked. The contact tracing worked. The failure emerged inside a system doing exactly what it had been designed to do against pathogens that obeyed familiar rules. That was what frightened Joran later. There was no obvious mistake he could condemn. No foolish delay, no administrator who ignored warnings, no careless physician who allowed an infected patient to wander through a crowded terminal. The recovery vessel reached the Thales habitat under full biological isolation. Remote drones entered first. Air samples came next, surface samples, then sealed medical units. Within 40 minutes, Concordance Laboratories had identified an unfamiliar self-propagating biological structure in the blood and respiratory tissue of several researchers. It behaved enough like a virus that the translation systems used the term. It was not a normal virus. Its replication machinery was strangely modular, with structures suggesting deliberate design or evolution under conditions no modern species recognized. Joran refused to speculate about origin. Speculation did not treat patients. The habitat was sealed. Every ship that had recently departed was traced. Every researcher contact was identified. Patients were transferred into isolated medical environments. The pathogen's first observable effects were unpleasant but manageable. Early symptoms included erratic temperature regulation, fatigue, shortness of breath, occasional sensory confusion, and minor vascular instability. Nothing Concordance medicine had not treated before. Joran's teams developed targeted supportive protocols before the first day ended. By the third day, most patients appeared stable. Laurel stood beside him in the central operations gallery as the curves flattened. "You look disappointed," she said. "I am cautious." That's a diplomatic word for pessimistic. It is a medical word for experienced. She smiled. Then patient 11 collapsed. No warning. One moment the researchers' vascular indicators were stable. The next, every system began failing. 3 more followed within an hour. The treatment teams responded immediately. The teams deployed artificial circulation, organ support, inflammatory suppression, and cellular stabilization. The patients did not die. Ulrich's medicine was too advanced for that to happen quickly. But pathogen measurements climbed despite treatment. Laurel leaned over the data. "We're treating the host." "Yes, not the infection." "We believed we were doing both." They were not. The pathogen had spent the apparent recovery period multiplying quietly. Its most dangerous feature was not obvious tissue destruction. It suppressed the early biochemical alarms that should have mobilized the host's defenses. By the time the immune system recognized the problem, infection was widespread. Joran altered the treatment protocol. The Concordance deployed a new targeted immune therapy. Replication dropped. For 2 days. During those 49 hours, the therapy looked like the kind of success that normally ended outbreaks. Viral load fell across most treated patients. Their vascular instability improved. Fever curves normalized. The treatment teams began discussing discharge criteria while the Concordance manufacturing network prepared millions of doses. Joran authorized scale-up because waiting for perfection would have cost lives. Then the replacement variant appeared inside 3 patients almost simultaneously, and the manufacturing order became obsolete before the first major shipment left orbit. Then returned. Different. The pathogen had changed. Joran stared at the new molecular profile. The change was not entirely random mutation. Something about the Sable Vector, named for the dark staining pattern it produced in one common diagnostic process, allowed it to shift around the dominant defense with terrifying efficiency. Laurel stood beside him. "How long did your therapy work?" 49 hours. "And now?" Joran watched the numbers rise. "Now it does not." That was the first failure. The second came 6 days later. Chapter 3. 12 Worlds. The Sable Vector had already left Thales. 3 research vessels departed before anyone knew an outbreak existed. One traveled to an Ulrich's trade hub. Another docked with a scientific relay station. The third transferred personnel through 2 inhabited systems. The Concordance found almost every contact. Almost. Outbreaks appeared anyway. 12 Worlds reported confirmed transmission within 23 days. Joran slept in intervals measured in minutes. The Health Concordance imposed travel screening. Travel screening escalated into route restrictions and then targeted closures. Hospitals built isolation capacity faster than patients arrived. Public information remained clear. No one hid the danger. No one exaggerated it. The galaxy had systems for this. Freight routes were rerouted instead of simply stopped. Essential medical cargo received protected transit windows. Schools shifted schedules before local outbreaks peaked. Public health teams published uncertainty instead of pretending certainty existed. The Concordance had learned long ago that panic grew fastest where institutions left an information vacuum. Joran watched millions of people cooperate with restrictions because the system had earned that trust before the crisis began. They worked. The problem was that the Sable Vector worked too. A civilization called the Adrani developed the first truly effective immune therapy. Their medical scientists identified the vector's suppression mechanism and designed a response that bypassed it. Patients treated early recovered. Transmission began falling. For 9 days, Joran believed the crisis had turned. On the 10th, 3 treated patients deteriorated. By the 12th, hundreds did. The Sable Vector had adapted around the Adrani response. Worse, the adaptation spread through their population with extraordinary effectiveness. Adrani immune architecture was one of the most stable in the Union. Thousands of years earlier, they had eliminated inherited variants associated with destructive inflammation and immune disorders. Their population retained diversity. The Adrani had not made themselves genetically identical. Their population still varied across countless traits. What had narrowed were specific immune pathways that physicians had spent millennia making safer and more predictable. That distinction mattered. The Sable Vector was not defeating genetic uniformity in a crude sense. It was exploiting medical success concentrated around the same reliable defensive architecture. But not much in the pathways the vector exploited. Once the pathogen learned the dominant Adrani defense, it had learned nearly all of them. Joran began examining other species. The pattern repeated. A therapy worked, the pathogen changed, and the population became vulnerable in broadly similar ways, not because their physicians were incompetent, because their physicians had spent millennia making immune systems reliable. Joran's own species had done the same. He pulled Olyric's historical records, 6,000 years without sustained natural disease. Thousands of generations of controlled medical inheritance. Variants associated with severe autoimmune disease removed where safe. Pathways producing dangerous inflammatory excess corrected. Rare immune deficits repaired. Health had improved beyond what their ancestors would have called miraculous. Now Joran saw the cost. It had not been a mistake. It had carried a cost. His assistant entered the operations room. Director. What? Confirmed human outbreaks. Joran looked up. How many? 7 settlements and 2 ships. He felt dread. Human medical history suggested what happened when infectious disease entered a population with broad biological variation and extensive social contact. Projected spread. Unclear. Mortality. The assistant hesitated, also unclear. Joran frowned. Why? The human data does not behave normally. Laurel, asleep in a chair against the wall, opened one eye. That, she said, sounds normal. Chapter 4. Which human, the first human family Joran examined, made no sense. 4 people, same household, same confirmed exposure event. A healthy 42-year-old adult developed severe disease and required respiratory support. His 71-year-old mother developed moderate symptoms, remained home under monitoring, and recovered. A 16-year-old tested positive repeatedly but never became visibly ill. The 4th family member experienced fever for 2 days and cleared the infection before treatment began. Joran assumed differences in infectious dose. The epidemiological model found no evidence for it. He checked treatment, no meaningful explanation. Age did not explain the difference and neither did underlying disease. Then he opened another household, 5 people, a completely different pattern. Another, different again. He summoned Laurel. She arrived carrying coffee and looking offended that the universe had invented another reason for her not to sleep. Joran projected the cases. These records are inconsistent. Yes. Your reporting standards. Excellent. Diagnostic calibration. Cross-checked. Then these outcomes should correlate with something. They probably do. Health status does not explain them. No. Age does not explain them. No. Exposure does not explain them. Apparently not. Joran turned. What is the standard human immune response to the Sable Vector? Laurel stared at him for a moment. Which human? He felt irritation. Humanity. That isn't a useful biological category at the resolution you're asking for. You are one species. So are you. Our immune responses are highly predictable. I know I'm jealous. Joran expanded the data. Your population appears disordered. Also true. You say that without concern. I've spent my career studying humans. Disorder is where I live. They began dividing the cases. They separated the cases by treatment status, severity, time to pathogen detection, inflammatory response, and clearance. The human dataset became uglier. Some patients mounted a strong early immune reaction and recovered. Others mounted a similarly strong reaction and suffered severe inflammation. Some showed relatively modest responses but cleared the pathogen anyway. Some never appeared to trigger the pathway the concordance considered necessary, yet infection still vanished. Joran stared at the plots. This is bad data. Laurel shook her head. No, it has no dominant shape. That's why you're calling it bad. What would you call it? She leaned toward the display. Potentially the best thing we've seen all month. Chapter 5. The noise. Joran hated human datasets. He tried not to make that personal. Humanity collected enormous quantities of medical information but rarely standardized it the way older civilizations did. Historical records used obsolete categories. Population studies disagreed. Terminology changed across centuries. Ethical rules varied across jurisdictions. Consent restrictions fragmented some datasets. And human biological diversity was irritatingly broad. Laurel seemed comfortable inside the chaos. She asked the concordance modelers to stop averaging the human response. That offended several of them. What do you mean, stop averaging? One asked. Your averages are deleting the thing we're trying to find. Joran watched her reorganize the cases. Instead of asking what humans usually did, she asked how many distinct response patterns existed. The answer became inconvenient. Hundreds. Some differed only subtly. Others were striking. Then Laurel separated patients by infection outcome, those who deteriorated. Those who recovered slowly, those who cleared quickly, those who remained asymptomatic. Joran watched a pattern begin to emerge. The first useful pattern was not genetic, it was temporal. Some human patients recognized the infection earlier. Some patients recognized the infection extremely early, before the Sable Vector fully suppressed the pathway it normally used to hide. How? Joran asked. Laurel shook her head. Don't know. Treatment? No. Prior exposure? Impossible as far as we know. Cross-reactive immunity from another pathogen? Maybe in some, doesn't explain all of them. Joran expanded the resistant group. Their genetics were not identical, not remotely. The first conclusion his systems produced was statistically useless. Laurel read it and smiled. Good. Why is failure good? Because we're still asking the wrong question. Joran was beginning to dislike that phrase. She pointed at the resistant profiles. These people are not protected for the same reason. That is exactly the problem. No, it might be the reason the vector can't beat all of them. Joran went silent. The thought was disturbing. The Sable Vector adapted rapidly when it encountered uniform defenses. Humans were not uniform. One host taught it one problem. The next host presented another. The next host presented another defensive problem and then another. The pathogen was still dangerous. Humans were dying. But the infection curve did not collapse into the same clean failure seen in optimized populations. Humanity's response looked like noise. The noise was buying them time. The models showed why. A vector lineage adapted to one human subgroup often lost some efficiency when it reached another. A mutation that improved immune suppression in one cluster could expose the pathogen sooner in a second. Transmission still occurred, but the pathogen had to keep solving new local problems instead of carrying one dominant solution through the whole population. Every extra generation it spent adapting was another interval in which clinicians could isolate patients, sequence changes, and test interventions. Chapter 6. The Ancestors. Laurel showed him history. Laurel showed him not the museum version of history, but the biological one. Human populations that survived ancient infections had carried different genetic compromises forward. Some variants increased resistance to one disease while increasing vulnerability to another. Some altered inflammatory response. Some affected cellular entry pathways. Some changed recognition mechanisms. Ancient viral remnants sat embedded in the human genome, evolutionary debris incorporated into biology over immense stretches of time. Other immune traits entered populations through interbreeding with archaic human relatives long extinct. Joran moved slowly through the archive. Disease after disease, century after century, human immune history did not follow one clean evolutionary path. It reflected thousands of local pressures. Migration mixed them. Isolation preserved others. Medicine later changed which traits mattered. Humanity never stabilized into one optimized immune architecture. That did not mean humans had refused medicine. Vaccination, sanitation, antivirals, antibiotics, vector control, screening, and targeted genetic therapies had erased enormous amounts of suffering. What humanity had not done was converge the entire species on one preferred immune design. Partly ethics, partly politics, partly technical caution, and partly the sheer difficulty of coordinating billions of people across centuries. What older civilizations saw as unfinished biological housekeeping had left behind a wider library of defensive possibilities. You have variants associated with serious autoimmune illness still circulating. Yes. Why were they not removed? Laurel looked at him. Because germline intervention at a species-wide level is politically, ethically, and practically complicated for humans. But some are harmful. Yes. You knowingly preserve them. We do preserve most of them. We just haven't declared a universal human genome and started editing everyone toward it. Joran considered how casually she said that. His own civilization had made similar choices thousands of years earlier. The Olerics had made those choices carefully and gradually with enormous benefits. He opened one ancient human pandemic record. A mortality estimate appeared. He stopped. So many. Laurel did not speak. Joran looked across the data. Genetic signatures, immune changes, historical bottlenecks. Inherited susceptibilities. The records were full of remnants and scars. Your species carries its epidemics inside itself. Laurel's expression changed slightly. Some of the scars, yes. Joran returned to the modern Sable data. He had no desire to romanticize what he had seen. The ancestors represented in those mortality records had not suffered for some future galactic purpose. They had suffered because disease was cruel and medicine had not yet been able to save them. But evolution was indifferent to dignity. It recorded survival anyway. The question was whether humanity's ancient scars contained anything useful now. Laurel insisted on one rule before they proceeded. No one would describe historical pandemics as gifts. The useful variants were survivors of catastrophe, not justification for catastrophe. If modern medicine could prevent the same suffering without sacrificing the underlying information, that was the better outcome. Joran agreed immediately. He had no interest in turning dead ancestors into a research strategy. Chapter 7. The Cost of Clean. Joran compared the Olerics population with humanity. The result embarrassed him until Laurel asked why. You made your people healthier, she said. We made them more uniform. In certain pathways. That is now killing them. Laurel shook her head. The vector is killing them. The distinction is rhetorical. No, it's important. She pointed at an Olerics health archive. Your immune optimization eliminated thousands of cases of autoimmune disease every year. Yes. Reduced allergies. Yes. Reduced cancer risk in several lineages. Yes. And gave physicians highly predictable responses. Yes. Would you undo 6,000 years of that because one pathogen finally exploited it? Joran did not answer. Laurel did. I wouldn't. He looked at her. You defend the system threatening your species' allies. I defend good medicine. We just found a blind spot. The distinction helped. Joran returned to the data without feeling that his ancestors had been fools. They had solved the problems they had. Humanity had solved different ones, or failed to solve them completely. Either way, Earth's biological diversity now presented the Sable Vector with an ugly landscape. Joran modeled adaptation. In the Adrani population, a successful vector mutation had access to most hosts immediately. Among humans, the same adaptation improved success in one subgroup and did little in another. A different mutation helped elsewhere but carried costs. The pathogen could still evolve, it simply could not find one master solution. Laurel watched the model. That's our time. What? The difference between adaptation and population-wide adaptation. Joran understood. Humans were not broadly immune to the Sable Vector. As a population, they were difficult for the pathogen to solve with one adaptation. For the moment, that was enough. For now. Chapter 8. The Survivors. The Concordance assembled a cohort of humans who had cleared confirmed infection unusually quickly. They were not experimental subjects in the old sense, but patients whose clinical data could be studied with consent. Laurel was unusually strict about that language. The crisis did not suspend consent merely because the data might be valuable. Patients could decline additional sampling. Existing records were used under emergency governance with independent review. Joran noticed that humans, despite their chaotic medical history, had developed an almost reflexive suspicion of research that treated people as raw material. He decided that history had left more than biological scars. The first genetic comparison disappointed everyone. There was no common resistance allele. There was no single ancient mutation and no elegant answer. Joran stared at the results. Laurel looked relieved. You keep being happy when the data disappoints me. Because you keep trying to make humans simple. I would settle for useful. She opened the functional response profiles. Stop looking for the lucky mutation. What should we look for? Laurel grouped the resistant patients differently. Look for what all the survivors' different answers accomplish. Joran leaned closer. The inherited traits varied. The receptor profiles varied. The inflammatory patterns varied, yet a common result appeared. The Sable Vector was detected early. They did not detect it through the same pathway or biochemical signal, but before the pathogen completed the suppression phase that made later treatment so difficult. Joran felt his pulse accelerate. The missing alarm. Laurel nodded. The Sable Vector's most important adaptation was silence. It entered cells, began replicating, and disabled the host's primary warning route. Optimized species relied heavily on that route because it was reliable against almost everything else. Human immune systems possessed overlapping, redundant, occasionally inefficient alternatives. In some people, one of those alternatives still noticed. Laurel enlarged 3 patients, completely different inherited patterns, same functional result. Early alarm, Joran stood. We do not need their genes. No, we need what their genes are causing the immune system to do. Exactly. For the first time since Thales, Joran saw a path forward. Chapter 9. Translation. The problem became translation. Alaric's biology was not human biology, neither was Adrani biology, nor any of the other infected species. Human antibodies could not simply be given to alien patients. Human cells would be incompatible. Human inherited variants meant little outside the context of human physiology. But the principle was transferable. Detect the Sable Vector before it silenced the dominant warning system. The Alaric's team designed a temporary synthetic alarm that did not depend on the suppressed pathway. The Adrani used a different method. Another species employed carefully controlled cellular reprogramming. A fourth used a tailored prophylactic platform designed around its own immune architecture. Joran coordinated all of them. Laurel never pretended to know alien biology better than alien physicians. That increased his respect for her. Humans had supplied the clue. The clue alone saved no one. Alaric's immunologists had to identify a synthetic sensor their cells could tolerate. Adrani physicians had to build an equivalent around a completely different signaling network. Manufacturing teams had to produce the therapies at scale, pharmacologists had to determine dosing, and public health coordinators had to decide who received prophylaxis first. The human contribution mattered because it changed the question. The galaxy's existing competence mattered because thousands of specialists could answer that new question quickly. The specialists turned it into medicine. The first Alaric's trial produced encouraging results. Pathogen replication slowed. Early markers appeared, patients stabilized. Joran almost allowed himself optimism. Then patient 17 deteriorated. Rapidly, the vector level fell. The patient's inflammatory response rose, tissue damage accelerated. Joran stared at the contradiction. The treatment worked. Laurel shook her head. Half of it did. What half? We made the immune system notice. And we didn't teach it when to stop. Joran looked at the patient's data. The body was clearing the Sable Vector. It was also injuring itself. Human immune diversity had revealed the first answer. Human medical history, with all the dangerous trade-offs visible in it, was about to reveal the second. Chapter 10. The Second Layer. Laurel returned to the resistant human cohort. Some cleared infection cleanly. Others cleared it but suffered severe inflammatory complications. Joran saw the old ugliness again. Human defenses were not polished. Evolution had selected for survival, not comfort. One pathway recognized danger quickly but overreacted. Another responded more slowly but shut down efficiently. A third depended on combinations that varied from person to person. This is why we spent millennia optimizing immune architecture, Joran said. Yes. You say that as if proving my point. I am proving your point. Laurel looked at him. You're better at controlling inflammation than we are. Generally. So use that. He understood. Humanity's advantage was not that its immune systems were superior. The variation had exposed the missing detection logic. The concordance could supply the precision. They redesigned the treatment, early artificial warning. Then controlled modulation once pathogen burden fell. Species-specific timing, species-specific limits. There was no universal treatment, only a family of species-specific solutions built from one shared principle. The next trial did not produce dramatic recovery. That was good. The patient remained ill. Support continued. Hours passed. The pathogen levels stopped rising. Inflammatory markers stabilized, then declined. Joran watched every number personally. He did not trust hope anymore. The next measurement improved. Then the next. Patient 23 stabilized too. Patient 24, 25. Across the Adrani network, similar results appeared. Joran stayed in the operations chamber until the first physician transmitted a message he had not heard since the crisis began. Patient improving. He replayed it once, then he went back to work. Chapter 11. The First Recovery. The first recovered Olyrix patient was named Hesak. Joran had never met him before the outbreak. He was a cargo coordinator, middle-aged, no scientific importance, no political importance. Exactly the kind of person public health systems existed to protect. Hesak had a partner, 2 children, and an elderly parent on another continent. None of those facts appeared in the treatment model, but Joran had started forcing himself to read the family fields anyway. Population health required thinking in curves and probabilities. It also required remembering that every point on the curve was somebody whose absence would reorganize a household. For 11 days, Hesak had hovered between recovery and multi-organ failure. The new treatment changed that. Recovery came slowly. Hesak's temperature stabilized, vascular support decreased, and his lungs improved. The Sable Vector became difficult to detect. 3 days later, he sat upright. Joran visited because he needed to see it. Hesak looked at him with exhausted amusement. You are taller than the broadcasts suggest. Joran blinked. That is your first observation. I have been unconscious. Fair. Hesak asked what had saved him. Joran could have given a complicated answer. Instead, he said, humans helped us find the part of the infection we were not seeing. Hesak nodded. I have heard humans are good at surviving unpleasant things. Joran thought of Laurel's historical archive. Yes. Hesak looked toward the window. Useful habit. By the end of the week, 20 Olyrix patients had recovered. Then hundreds. The treatment remained imperfect. Some patients arrived too late, some did not respond, some died, but mortality changed direction. That mattered. The Concordance issued emergency manufacturing orders across hundreds of systems. Factories shifted production. Medical ships carried species-specific therapies. Public health teams combined treatment with containment. For the first time, the galaxy was no longer reacting. Factories on worlds that had never seen a human patient were now producing therapies inspired by human response diversity. Olyrix clinicians contributed inflammation control protocols back to human hospitals treating severe cases. Adrani researchers shared suppression bypass designs that improved one of Earth's own prophylactic platforms. The breakthrough had begun with humanity's biological messiness. But survival became a cooperative engineering problem. It was pushing back. Chapter 12. The archive opens. Humanity's next decision surprised Joran more than the biology had. Earth opened its archives. The decision was not automatic. Human institutions argued over privacy, historical consent, indigenous data rights, military records, commercial genomic databases, and who had authority to release what. The final emergency framework was slower than some concordance officials wanted and far more restrictive than others expected. Laurel defended both features. Humanity was offering centuries of medical history, she said, not surrendering ownership of every human body represented inside it. Earth did not release everything. Some data remained protected by consent and privacy law. But governments, universities, hospitals, public health institutions, research networks, and historical biobanks released enormous volumes of immune response information for emergency analysis. The release included centuries of population studies, archived outbreak records, old blood samples, genetic surveys, longitudinal health data, and ancient medical literature. Comparisons between populations exposed to different historical pathogens. Records from pandemics humanity had once considered its greatest biological humiliations. Joran opened one dataset and found it almost unusably messy. Methods changed halfway through. Terminology differed across regions. Measurements were incomplete. Laurel looked over his shoulder. "Welcome to historical medicine." "This is terrible." "Keep scrolling." He did. Buried inside the old study was a response pattern similar to one found among Sable survivors. The old pattern was not identical, but it was close enough to suggest another redundant recognition pathway. Another dataset revealed a different possibility. The archive was not clean. It was deep. Joran authorized a new concordance classification. Human Epidemiological Archive. Previous designation. Historical Pathology. New designation. Strategic Biological Diversity Resource. Laurel read the title. That is the ugliest compliment humanity has ever received. It is administratively precise. It sounds like you want to store us in a warehouse. Joran considered changing it. He did not. The archive transformed the research effort. Humanity's long history of disease became searchable evidence of how many different defensive strategies one species could carry at once. Not every old scar mattered. Enough did. Chapter 13. The World's Bend. The Sable Vector reached its greatest spread 2 months after Thales. 31 worlds maintained emergency medical restrictions. Transit moved under screening protocols. Hospitals overflowed on several heavily affected planets. The Concordance's support systems performed exactly as designed. Patients who would have died under primitive medicine survived long enough for treatment to reach them. Then the new therapies arrived in sufficient quantity. Joran watched the galactic outbreak map every morning. For weeks the curve climbed, then it flattened. He did not trust it. The next day it flattened again, then declined slowly across multiple species, different treatments, different immune systems, same strategic principle, warn early, control the response. Do not let the vector hide. On the 43rd day after mass deployment, active severe cases fell below the previous month's level. On the 51st, transmission dropped across the major trade network. On the 60th, 3 worlds ended emergency restrictions. Joran stood alone in the operations room late at night. He overlaid the original species response models. The optimized populations produced beautiful curves. The optimized populations produced clean, predictable curves, and when the vector defeated their dominant architecture, the curves collapsed almost together. Then he displayed humanity. Humanity's map was jagged and contradictory with hundreds of patterns, some terrible, some protective, some useless, and some unexpectedly effective. He removed ancestry, age, geography, every category that had distracted the early analysis. He grouped the survivors only by function, different biology, same result. They had sounded the alarm. Joran stared at the human map. The data looked like chaos. For the first time in his life, chaos looked expensive to underestimate. Chapter 14. The Treasure. The Sable Vector epidemic ended gradually. There was no dramatic final patient and no single day when the galaxy declared victory. Outbreaks became clusters, clusters became isolated cases, and isolated cases became surveillance alerts. The Concordance never learned exactly what the Sable Vector had originally been designed to do. Perhaps the vector had been a weapon, a failed medical system, or something stranger. Joran stopped caring. The living mattered more than the dead civilization that had made it. After the crisis, the Galactic Health Concordance established the Diversity Preservation Initiative. The name was Laurel's suggestion. Joran admitted privately that it was better than his. The program did not preserve disease. It preserved information. The initiative funded frozen cell archives, anonymized response databases, pre-optimization genetic records, and simulation libraries describing pathways that no longer circulated widely in living populations. Species could continue eliminating disease and harmful inherited traits while preserving enough scientific memory to reconstruct lost variation conceptually if a future threat exploited the optimized state. It preserved immune response libraries, population-level variation, historical pathogen records, and records of rare biological traits before optimization removed them. Every species retained its right to improve health. No one proposed restoring harmful disorders, simply because variation might someday be useful. They simply stopped deleting the record of what had once existed. Humanity became one of the program's founding partners. During the first council meeting, Joran asked Laurel a question he had postponed. Do humans feel vindicated? She looked at him. About what? The galaxy dismissed your biological history as primitive. It is now considered one of the most valuable medical archives known. Laurel answered immediately, no. Joran waited. I'd rather our ancestors never suffered any of it. Then she opened the next research file. There was no speech or philosophical conclusion. Work remained. Joran found he respected that. Chapter 15. Imperfect. 7 years later, Joran returned to teaching. The lecture hall had changed. Human immune maps now appeared in the standard epidemiology curriculum. He displayed 2 models. The first was Olyrix. The Olyrix model was elegant, stable, and predictable. The second was human. It looked as if someone had dropped colored glass across the screen. A student raised one hand. Director, which architecture is superior? Joran considered. For ordinary preventive medicine, ours offers substantial advantages. The student looked surprised. Then why study the human system? Because you asked the wrong question. Several students smiled. Apparently Laurel's habits had contaminated him. Joran enlarged the human map. Predictability is useful, so is variation. He highlighted the resistant Sable profiles. Do not mistake uniform success for universal resilience. Then he opened the Human Ancestral Immunity Archive. Millions of records filled the display. The archive did not contain one answer. It contained millions. Some records were harmful, obsolete, or medically irrelevant. Others might be waiting for a problem no one had encountered yet. The students went quiet. Joran let them look. For the moment, that was enough. Chapter 16. The Old Classification. The Health Concordance formally retired the phrase unstable immune heritage from its human medical reference guide. Joran had not known the classification existed until Laurel showed it to him. She was offended. He was embarrassed. It was written before humanity joined the concordance fully. That makes it older, not better. It referred to population-level variation. It sounds like we're one sneeze away from exploding. Joran approved the revision. The new classification read, High-diversity immune architecture. Laurel considered it better. You are impossible to satisfy. That's why you keep me around. The revised guide spread through medical systems. So did a new outbreak planning assumption. When confronting an unknown pathogen, model not only average susceptibility but the distribution of rare resistance profiles. The lesson seemed obvious now. Most important lessons did after someone nearly died discovering them. Joran preferred this one written down. Epilogue. A scar. Laurel took Joran to Earth 12 years after the Sable Vector. They visited a medical history museum in a city rebuilt so many times that Joran could not distinguish ancient districts from modern reconstruction. The exhibits were quiet. The exhibits included old quarantine notices, vaccination campaigns, photographs of exhausted nurses, primitive protective equipment, and hospital wards filled during pandemics. Handwritten records from eras when physicians could identify disease, but could do very little to stop it. Joran moved more slowly as they approached a memorial wall. Thousands of names, one outbreak, one period in Earth's history. Laurel stood beside him. Your species survived an extraordinary amount, Joran said. She looked at the names. Not everyone did. He felt ashamed of the phrasing. Then he noticed a newer plaque mounted beside the memorial. It described the Sable Vector crisis. The words explained that immune variants and response patterns first documented through humanity's long history of infectious disease had helped researchers identify the early warning principle later adapted across hundreds of worlds. Joran read it twice. The plaque did not call the old pandemic beneficial. That restraint mattered to him. The Sable crisis had made it easy for outsiders to speak admiringly about humanity's ancient immune inheritance without seeing the cost that produced it. The museum refused that simplification. It placed the names first and the later discovery second. The value of what survived did not retroactively make the suffering acceptable. It did not call the suffering necessary. It simply recorded what had come afterward. He looked at Laurel. Do humans have a word for something terrible that leaves behind something valuable? Laurel considered the memorial, then the plaque, a scar. Joran looked once more at the names. Yes,